a quote attributed to Zapata is, "It is better to die on your feet than to live on your knees." So, my question for you is that a reasonable statement? Or would you call it too extreme? So, here in the place called the United States, we actually have a very similar sentiment, a very similar idea. That's actually the official motto of one of the states, and that state being New Hampshire. And that motto is live free or die. You'll even see that on the quarter, right? On the back of our quarters, our coin, the 25-cent coin, we have different images and quotes and such for different states and for national parks and so on. It's actually a cool thing on the money that we got going here. And perhaps the coolest of them all is the New Hampshire quarter that has this statement, live free or die. And this is taken from a quote by a soldier of the American Revolutionary War, John Stark. And the end of that quote was, death is not the worst of evils. So live free or die, that death is not the worst of evils. So we have two revolutionary figures of history, both saying pretty much the same thing, right? It's better to die on your feet than to live on your knees, and live free or die. I want to clarify here, that neither were communist, right? Neither were, because revolutionary now is oftentimes associated with communist revolutionaries, but neither Emiliano Zapata or John Stark were proposing an all-powerful state to, manage society. Quite the opposite. So they were revolutionaries in the sense of being against state control, against slavery. They were freedom fighters, right? Pro-freedom revolutionaries. So live free or die. Better to die on your feet than to live on your knees. To put this in context of what's been going on the past year, we have had increased restrictions on everyday people, on the population, that are unusual, right? That are an increase from what people have been normally experiencing, right? Prior to 2020, the state mandating preventative healthcare choices for individuals was not a normal thing at all. It would actually, be criticized, I think, as an extreme overreach, a violation of people's right to make their own medical decisions. But with daily media hype and, propaganda, just over and over and over again, day after day, month after month, and now over a year, people have kind of lost sight that controlling someone's body, telling them what to do as far as medical choices, is actually an abusive thing to do. And as I've said before, and I'll say again, the way to clarify this is to think on the small scale. Think about one neighbor and another neighbor, two next door neighbors. Could one neighbor walk over to his neighbor, knock on the door, and say, "Hey, Joe, um, flu season's coming up again, and I've been doing a lot of research, and I've determined that a certain amount of vitamin C would be very beneficial. In fact, I think that if everyone were to take this amount of vitamin C, flu cases would dramatically drop. And so there would be less people suffering from the flu. So as you can see here, I have this this bag of liquid IV, with an intravenous drip here, the needle at the end. So I'm just going to need you to take a seat as I, put this needle in your arm and get this intravenous vitamin C into your bloodstream. Most people, I think it's safe to say, and I'm not appealing to the majority here, I'm appealing to just a rational, sane perspective on ethics. Most people would agree that that's not okay. I can't force my neighbor to take a medical treatment, even if I have scientific studies that I could say even prove that it would be effective. Even if I can make the best argument in the world about why this particular natural treatment would definitely, without a doubt, reduce flu cases, it doesn't matter. The medical efficacy, the effectiveness of the treatment would be irrelevant to the issue of whether I had the right to forcibly inject some form of medicine into my neighbor's body, right? So that's, you could call an extreme example, right? You might say, well, there's no one busting down doors and, injecting things into people's body, like holding them down. But is it on that spectrum, right? I would argue yes. Because if you're being coerced into taking a medical treatment, they may not be physically holding you down, but they may be coercing you, forcing you, using aggression in other ways. Like, you can't continue at your present employment unless you get this injection, or you can't travel outside of this area unless you get this injection, or even you can't go to this store anymore and purchase the necessities of life, food and clothing and water, unless you get this medical treatment, right? Those all are definitely forms of coercion, right? Coercing someone to take a medical treatment. So even if they're not physically holding you down, it's still a form of coercion. And if you can't see that, you're just not thinking clearly. I have no, like soft, easy way to tell you anything else. That's just the fact. So here we're talking about coercion, right? What is slavery? What is living on your knees? What is not living free? The definition of slavery is controlling someone else's body and life against their will, right? Claiming them as your property, similar to how humans often treat animals, particularly on farms, right? The cow or the pig is considered the property of the farmer, and the farmer can, it's believed, do whatever he or she wants to that animal because the animal is their property, right? Farmers oftentimes inject all kinds of medicines and vaccines and such into the animals, right? Antibiotics are given, so on and so forth. I'll return to the human realm here and point out that slavery is basically a condition of losing agency over your own life, right? Losing control over your own life, your own body. You can no longer make decisions for yourself. And medical decisions should definitely be considered part of that agency, right? Part of that freedom. So if we're being coerced into taking medical treatments, whether we think they're good or not, it's not being given as an option in many places, right? With these travel restrictions in particular, right? You need to show proof. They're saying that you need to show proof of vaccination in order to travel, right? So that's definite coercion, because what if you really need to travel for whatever, or just really want to even, right? They're saying, well, if you want that freedom, you need to obey, right? So returning to Emiliano Zapata and John Stark, based on what they said, it doesn't seem likely that they would be okay with being controlled in this way. Emiliano Zapata might respond to this whole current medical tyranny with that quote again. He might repeat himself and say, "It is better to die on your feet than to live on your knees." And so the question to contemplate is it really better? Is it true that death is not the worst? Would it be okay to actually just be super safe, but not free at all? When I was talking to a young woman recently about the lockdown, I brought up the example of, well, would you be okay with me forcing some medical treatment onto you, even if I could, even if it sounded really good, or even if I could um, provide scientific studies that showed that it was beneficial. Again, going back to the vitamin C example, I said, do you think it's okay for me to do that to you? And she said, well, no, no. And I said, well, right, of course not. I said, so why do you think it's okay for a politician to do it to you? And she said, well, I think it's a question of scale. A question of scale. So it's not okay to do it to one person, but it is okay to do it to 1 billion people. It's just irrationality underneath this abuse. It doesn't actually hold up to any kind of clear thinking, critical thinking, analysis. If it's not okay for me to do it to one person, why would it be okay for me to do it to 1 billion people just because I have the title governor or just because I have the title president? What changes on an ethical level? Nothing. Actually, it's just a billion times worse because I've just multiplied the abuse times 1 billion. So to think that increasing the scale of abuse justifies abuse is actually crazy. But in fairness to those that are sort of caught up in that muddled thinking, we've been, again, inundated with so much indoctrination and propaganda and logical fallacies that it can almost seem kind of reasonable, even though it's not at all. Even though it really is that simple, that if one neighbor can't do it to another neighbor, if you can identify it clearly as abuse on that level, then it remains abuse, regardless of what uniform one person is wearing or regardless of what employment one person has. Those are irrelevant factors. Another irrelevant factor, what you could call a red herring in the logical fallacy category, is how severe the crisis is. And this is something that I didn't speak about as well as I could have previously, because the common counter argument is, well, what if it could save lives? And my response to that was, well, first of all, the people talking about the crisis could be lying about the crisis altogether, or lying about the severity of it, or they could have been the ones that even created the crisis in the first place. Or they could have great intentions. It could be a real crisis, but what they're proposing actually isn't good for you, right? They might say, oh, I got this wonder drug here that I think is going to save the world, but maybe it's actually a dangerous drug. And so even though they had good intentions, it doesn't mean that they can force it on everybody, right? So the question of whether abuse is legitimate just because it might actually make people safer uh, needs to be looked at more directly, right? Because I was talking about how the person could be deceptive or mistaken, but I didn't get into, okay, well, let's say they're not deceptive and they're not mistaken. Getting back to this vitamin C example, right? I think anyone who is saying, hey, make sure that you have a healthy level of vitamin C in the human body, right? The human body needs a certain level of vitamin C. If you don't have enough, you get the illness called scurvy, right? It's just scientific fact that the body needs this vitamin, right? So that's not deceptive to say so, and it's not mistaken to say so. And if everyone on the planet was free of vitamin C deficiency, that would be better than people being deficient, right? So I believe what I just said is true. I'm not being deceptive about it. It's like saying humans need a certain amount of water or a certain amount of air, right? If someone doesn't get enough water, they'll die. That's just a fact. Right? If a person doesn't get air, they'll die. So saying water deficiency or air deficiency is unhealthy is true. It's not deceptive. It's not mistaken. However, I can't go to my neighbor's house and say, hey, how many glasses of water did you drink today? Right? And he might say, well, none. And I say, oh, well, you're in danger of water deficiency. And so I'm going to have to coerce you. I'm going to have to force you to drink some water right now. Again, I'm going to tie you down, force you to drink this bottled water. That's not acceptable, right? I'm treating him or her like my slave. So coming back to this question of whether medical mandates are legitimate because they might actually decrease the level of illness in the world. Like I said before, on an ethical level, this is irrelevant. And this is the crux of it. This is the point that people are avoiding. They just keep reverting back to, yeah, but it might save lives, or yeah, but it might, it might flatten the curve. And I've often said, like, you're missing the point. And perhaps I should have said that point being, live free or die. That point being, it is better to die on your feet than to live on your knees. That point being perfectly safe, but also being a slave is not a utopia, right? Life imprisonment is a punishment. It's not a liberation, right? It's not a reward. We're not being helped, right? When someone is put in prison for life, that's not something we do for individuals that we want to reward, right? It's a punishment. And why is that? Because it's a very unpleasant experience. It's not what humans are here for, right? We're not here to be slaves, right? Jesus said he came to set the captives free, right? Save them from captivity, right? Captivity is not preferable, even if that captivity is very safe. So when I hear businesses now with ads on the radio saying safety is our number one priority, right? Like this is a badge of honor to put safety above all else. I would again remind folks that are becoming so safety centric that you can be a perfectly safe prisoner, but that isn't a life worth living, right? You can be imprisoned in a padded room, force-fed superfoods and vitamins and the purest water on earth, purified air, everything, just perfectly safe. No toxins, no dangers. You'd be tied up yourself too, of course, right? To prevent you from hurting yourself, right? So you would just be tied up, put in a padded room, but perfectly safe. The thing to realize is that's not actually safe, right? You're actually just being abused constantly, right? Abuse and safety don't actually go together. So this is how people have been tricked. They've been fed the lie that some abuse is okay if it increases safety. But when you realize abuse decreases safety, you can recognize that that's a contradiction in terms. You can recognize actually freedom is another form of safety. So if you're decreasing my freedom in the name of safety, you're just lying. You're just being deceptive. You're just mistaken. Safety is not actually a good principle to orient our entire society around. What is a good principle? Well, returning to Jesus, who even Christians often ignore, he said, the greatest law is a law of love. To love God, to love others, and to love yourself. He said all of the teachings of the prophets and all the previous laws, on a moral life can be summed up by this law, to love. And the opposite of love is abuse. And he didn't say there were any exceptions. He didn't say the law is love unless there's a crisis, unless there's an emergency, and then it's okay to be unloving, then it's okay to be abusive. Yeah, he didn't say that. He didn't say that because it's not true, right? For safety, abuse is being justified, but being indefinitely abused isn't safe. Again, so it's a contradiction. It's doing the opposite of what it's claiming to do. Safety is actually being in a condition of freedom and a condition of love, right? If people are being loving towards you and you have your freedom, then you're safe. If people are being abusive towards you and you don't have your freedom, then you're not safe. So you might, again, just be reverting back to, well, what about a sickness? Like I said previously, two bad things, when combined, don't result in a better situation. It's just worse. It's just, as they say, insult added to injury. It's been said that two main tools of the devil are sickness and violence. Those are perhaps his two main vehicles for trying to make the world as hellish as possible. So if those two vehicles are purely bad, why would you think adding one in response to the other would make the world a better place? That's basically what this whole lockdown perspective boils down to. Oh, there's sickness in the world? Let's add abuse to that. That'll work. That'll help. No, it doesn't actually help. You just made it worse. And if you say, well, but it might save some lives, again, you're ignoring the fact that the more you increase the restriction, the more you're enslaving people, which is a negative, right? So you can't say making someone's life worse in one way is justified because you've made it better in another. Again, the prisoner who's kept free of all toxins, you could say, oh, well, I take such good care of my prisoner. You know, they only get the best organic, vegan, superfood on the planet. You know, I just feed him such healthy meals every day. He's so healthy. Right? Would that be justification for enslaving a man? Could I enslave someone because I keep them in perfect health? No. No, I couldn't. And why is that? That's the question. Why is that not okay? And why, perhaps, again, for you to consider, might Emiliano Zapata and John Stark have been correct in stating that it's better to die on your feet than live on your knees, and that it's better to live free. Death is preferable to a life that doesn't have freedom. Death is not the worst. All right, thank you for listening.